So, if we go back to the original E-series, it was the late 70s, early 80s, and analog equipment was inherently noisy. And you were recording onto a tape machine that inherently had some noise that was involved with it. And Colin Sanders, who's the founder of SSL, had a principle that he always wanted to design equipment that sounded like you were in the room with the musicians, something that didn't change the character of it. He had this philosophy of you can always add colour, but you can't take it away. So trying to replicate what was there from the start. And the E-series, he could see a lot of stuff that was wrong with it from that perspective. So he challenged the design team to work on a low noise console, taking all the ergonomics and recall and remote technology we'd already generated and bring it into something that was quieter, that would transmit the sound better. And we were very lucky to have an incredibly talented designer working for us at that time called Paul Frindle. And Paul took the existing circuits from the E-series and dabbled with them. And so he designed a new low noise mic preamp at the front of the channel strip. The dynamic section stayed exactly the same as it was from the E-series, but he designed an entirely new EQ curve, which is called the 292 or G-series black knob. And this was, unlike the earlier E-series, it was a variable Q. So with low boosts or cuts, it was a wide band, and as you boosted more, it was more steep. At maximum gain or minimum gain, the E-series and G-series curves are the same shape, but the way they get to it is very different. There was also a big upgrade in the total recall and automation on the G-series computer, which a lot of people with E-series retrofitted because of the way that you could do mixed passes and save these things work much better. Sonically, the G-series was less hissy, for want of a better way of describing it. It had a certain way of driving the channels and the mix bus, which was different to the way the E-series did. That kind of had a nice crunch, and a lot of the rock engineers jumped on it straight away, and many of them still go with it today. A new concept came out of SSL called super analog, and it first came in the J-series desk. And the idea was to be as true to in and out and phase and width and depth as possible. And we did this by three main design choices. The first is that we don't have transformers in the audio signal path. Now, I'm not going to tell you transformers are bad, because sometimes a great big preamp loaded with iron is just the thing that sounds right. However, what it does is to make it sound right, you have to drive a transformer, and this adds a little bit of distortion into the signal. As getting rid of distortion was the main goal, transformers didn't go in. Similarly with VCAs on the fader groups, VCAs add certain distortions and non-linearities into the system. And we knew a lot of engineers were already mixing with the VCAs off. So we changed that, and we moved to a system that we designed called MDAC, which is a very, very high precision D to A that controls an analog gain stage. The third and probably most important factor is that we don't put any capacitors in the audio signal path. Now, putting a capacitor into something is a bit like putting an EQ curve in something, and how far apart the plates are and what material is between the plates and how degraded that is will affect the way the current passes across and thus the sound of it. So by having no capacitors, we have a completely flat frequency response between 20 Hz and 20K, and we have an extended frequency response over 200 kHz at the top end. In fact, the 9000K console could pass half a hertz. It could pass DC through audio. The other thing about capacitors is they take a finite time to fill up with charge before they discharge to let the current through. And in plucked acoustic instruments, in beautiful rooms, the transients, those first few microseconds of a sound, give our brains so much positional and tonal information through psychoacoustics. And sometimes in something like a tube circuit, for example, it has a softer effect on harsh vocalists. That's because it's slow and it's missing out these first few transients. So because we don't have capacitors charging up or tubes getting into the warmth section, our circuits react much quicker. So we can pick up the true representation of those very first few milliseconds in a signal. And when you combine that with the phase response that we get by not having capacitors, we're much greater time aligned, you end up with a much wider, deeper, bigger sound. Some would say sparkly. The design story behind the Nucleus is quite an interesting one, because product strategy will always shift a little bit as you go along. And the product manager and I had a vision of a rack mount Lego kit roll your own mixing desk. And the idea originally was that Nucleus would be the counterpart to the X desk. So it'd be the same size, it would be in the same kind of chassis, and you could roll bits of a console as you wanted them into your desk. But as we started looking at the feature set, we started to discover more and more that this was really a product that was going to be designed for someone who was doing everything in the box, who was about workflow, who was about recall, who was about creativity with their hands without letting the mouse get in the way, because the mouse is hand-eye coordination, it's not a creative brain function. So we took a step back and decided that we had two hands. So we needed to make a control surface that was big enough to put two hands on. Most of my sales team are actually left-handed, and from watching them doing demos on the Matrix, I was getting bored of seeing them reach their left hand over their right to hit the transport controls. So I thought, okay, we put the center section with transport controls in the middle, two banks of faders, so you can do things with both hands, and whether you're left or right-handed, you could do that. And instantly, Nucleus became something that was 16 faders and twice the size. So we then started looking at this type of customer, how much are they recording a whole band? Not very often. It's maybe, one or two mics, an overdub of a vocal. It could be for voiceover, it could be for post, it could be for the guy in his bedroom doing dance music. So we thought about, well, what inputs and outputs does it need? And what would you want in this middle, to listen to things and toggle between the mics and have a zero latency monitoring system. And so from having an original concept of Nucleus as part of a small family of things that got plugged together, we ended up with something that was far more of a standalone, complete solution, which I think makes it a little more elegant as a single thing. So that was quite interesting and fun to go through, starting with one idea and then taking the feedback and seeing it shift as you go through the product development process.